I thought maybe we could start by we have a video queued up created by the New York Taxi Workers Alliance that kind of talks a little bit about what they're fighting for. We could play that.
New York City knowingly inflated the price of the medallions and made $850 million off of these sales.
The price in 2002 was $200,000. It skyrocketed to $800,000 just 12 years later. How did that happen?
The collapse of the medallion market is one of the greatest government failures in the history of our city. And the humanitarian crisis of foreclosures and bankruptcies and suicides should not be seen as an accident. Not only were we complacent as a regulator, but we were complicit as a speculator through deceptive advertising, through approval of predatory transactions, through auctions.
You know, there's like an actual real human impact in all of this.
I owe about $560,000.
I owe $730,000.
$485,000.
$372.
$435,000 debt.
I work all this time. I don't have no retirement, nothing.
This is drivers that have sacrificed for this city, and the city just turned their backs on it.
After months of our organizing, the City of New York responded with a fund, a Medallion Relief Fund.
Unfortunately, the TLC has come up with this plan. It's poorly structured, it's inadequate for far too many from the very start. So we need New York City to make a plan that will deliver real workable relief.
If we take the city's plan, then most of the drivers would be forced to work 10-hour days and 6 days a week in order to take home less than minimum wage. How can you feed your family on that?
We are calling on the City of New York to add a guarantee, have the city guarantee these loans so the risk is no longer on the backs of our members, our families can finally survive, and on top of that, the lenders will have enough incentive to agree to the debt restructuring that we are talking about.
We are going to stage a camp out in front of City Hall until our demands are met. You could come by, you could take pictures and tweet to your elected officials, letting them know what is happening in New York City.
So, this conflict kind of centers around the value of these medallions for taxi cab drivers. So can you kind of explain, what these medallions are? I had a hard time understanding them totally. How did these prices rise so much, and what has been the effect of these medallion prices on the drivers?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that, for those who don't know, medallions are the system by which the city licenses vehicles for the privilege of picking up passengers across the 5 boroughs as a taxi. It was created in the earlier it's the 10th day of a hunger strike. So I'm having trouble sometimes formulating my thoughts. But it was created in the early 20th century as a means to create like a regulated system of taxi operation in New York City. And for many decades, the medallion's value was between $130,000 to $200,000. And then the Bloomberg administration came into power in 2001. The city had a $3.1 billion shortfall, and it was in debt in that amount. And the Bloomberg administration pinpointed medallions as a means by which they could make up some of that shortfall, and a means by which they could make up some revenue. And so over the next decade and some change, the city made over $855 million from the sale of new medallions. And the city ran these auctions. The city would set the opening bid, and the price of a medallion went from $200,000 to $1 million, with the highest opening bid being set by the city in that time at $850,000. And so this crisis comes from the fact that nothing about this market fundamentally changed between the time when it was $200,000 to $1 million. It was just that the city saw it as a means by which of making revenue and artificially inflated the price of the medallion so as to make more revenue. And they did so knowingly, because the agency, there was a memo that was circulated that said the price of the medallion is outstripping the actual worth of the medallion. And in concurrence with this, the city let in Uber and Lyft, let in 100,000 ride-sharing vehicles into that same market, whose entire value was predicated on the fact that it was a limited license so as to guarantee future income. And so all of those things together, combined with the fact that the agreements that these drivers then got into were very predatory from the jump. In fact, lenders which had been barred from operating in the housing market after 2008 were welcomed in by the city to operate in the medallion lending market. And then to top all of it off, you have the fact that native-born New Yorkers were not buying medallions at the rate the city wanted them to, and so active advertising went towards immigrant New Yorkers. And 94% of drivers are immigrants. And so if you couple the lack of, bureaucratic English language fluency with predatory lending agreements, with deceptive advertising from the city, with this idea that this is your ticket to the middle class and achieve the American dream you immigrated for, you have a situation such as this, where 9 drivers have taken their own lives in the last few years, and we have people hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt and fighting for a chance to live.
What was the reaction of taxi drivers when that exorbitant medallion price was implemented? And I also just want to, before you answer that question, note that we see similar behavior in California, where I live, a blue state, and the failed policies and the increase of poverty as a result of those failed policies give the right wing fodder, right? They act as if these are left wing policies that have been proven to fail. But in reality, I mean, this is more and more of regressive taxation as a result of the unwillingness to increase taxes for people at the very top.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very much tied to that. It's that issue of who is allowed to suffer and who is allowed to be targeted. I mean, even if you think about congestion pricing, which we've been waiting for so many years, New York City has been waiting for it, but the only people that they have put that pricing on is taxi drivers. And there are so many different forms of taxation on a taxi driver that and these are all regressive sales charges. And so it is quite interesting to see the different approaches the state has towards taxation depending upon who suffers from it. And I think that, your question to what the reaction was when the medallion was selling at $1 million, the issue is that at that time, as the medallion value was going up, drivers were made to feel as if this was a good thing for them because it meant that they had an asset that was appreciating, and the city was telling them it would continue to appreciate because the city said more tourists were coming. This was actually better than the stock market. They were telling them that this was the best deal they could find. And so every time the price would go higher, people thought this was a good thing. This meant that I have more value in the work that I do, and I have an ability to refinance my medallion and get a house for my family and achieve all the things that I was told that this medallion would help me achieve. The issue is that this was never going to be able to be paid for, either by these drivers or, even if Lyft and Uber hadn't come in, this was a bubble that was about to burst. And that is, why right now we're on the 10th day of our hunger strike. We are outside of City Hall. We go there every day. The drivers are there 24/7. I visit them every single day. And it is a hunger strike to get the city to change their debt relief plan, which they released earlier this year, saying that it would resolve this crisis. And it's completely insufficient. And to change that plan and to add something which would be a city-backed guarantee, which would guarantee these loans and ensure that if there was ever a default from a driver, the city would step in. And by guaranteeing these loans, removing the risk for these lenders, thereby incentivizing the lenders to actually offer affordable terms for these drivers.
And can you, just for our audience to kind of get a sense of just how hard taxi drivers work, especially in New York City, can you kind of describe like the day in the life of a taxi driver, and especially the health risks that, are kind of come with the job?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a taxi driver typically works at least 6 days a week. They work 10, 12, 14, 16 hours. They get up in the morning, and these days, because of the nature of the market, they typically start their day at an airport because that is one of the few places where there's still a guaranteed fare. And then from there, they drive usually into the city or, Manhattan, and look to pick up passengers for those 10, 12, 14, 16 hours. And the issue is every day when they start their day, they're already underwater in terms of the fees they have to pay just to be on the road. These are 50, 60, 70-year-old drivers, typically men, 94% of whom are immigrants. And the act of being on the road for that long every day, it is also it has consequences for your physical health, not only for being in that position, not only for being stuck in a chair, but because there are no bathrooms that these drivers can find to use. There are so many restaurants which refuse to use them, let them use the bathrooms. There are so many complications that come from suppressing the need to go to the bathroom. There are so many different consequences that these men face for being the faces of our city. And what is so infuriating about this struggle is that our politicians traffic in the symbolism of taxis and the symbolism of immigrants. But when it comes to the substance of it, these men are being told to suffer on the margins and suffer out of view and in the outer boroughs, and for many of them to die. And I am hopeful that we can find a way to a resolution. But make no mistake, it's only because these drivers have been organizing and protesting and are now on hunger strike.
So you were recently arrested for your part in joining the hunger strike in solidarity. Can you talk about why you were arrested and, like what happened that day? Absolutely.
So this was on Monday of this week. And by the way, just to let people know, this is the New York Taxi Worker Alliance sweatshirt. This is the ribbon that we wear if we're on hunger strike. So on Monday, we had started the hunger strike. Maybe we were 6 or 7 days into the hunger strike. And at that point, in weeks and months and years prior, it had become clear to us that the mayor is the decision maker on this issue. And the mayor has been obstructing the pursuit of justice for these working class drivers. And in the way often it comes out in our political organizing is that we have to make clear to the public as to what is going on in the political sphere. And so if we were being obstructed there, then we had to obstruct day-to-day life in our city to bring attention to that fact. And so myself and 5 other elected officials and elected officials to be, we sat down right in front of City Hall and stopped traffic. And we were arrested for it. And, these tactics of civil disobedience, of being on a hunger strike, they are tactics of seeking to penetrate public consciousness so as to bring attention to the suffering that has largely been considered, a niche issue for so many in politics.
And you've mentioned kind of the effect of rideshare apps like Uber and Lyft, and this problem, of course, is not going away with these apps and kind of what they're doing to our economy. And so, as a left legislator trying to think through these problems, I mean, what do you think? What does meaningful reform or regulation look like, or could look like, when it comes to these apps?
Well, I mean, these apps make a loss every year because their business model is just about entirely removing all competition from their market. And then once they do so, to operate at the actual cost levels, which will be completely unaffordable for anyone and everyone. I think that there's so many things to do. You had mentioned earlier the example of this being reminiscent of what's happening in California. We look to California to see both the possibilities of how we can take on rideshare companies and what they will do in return and how they will fight back. I mean, these drivers are not contractors. They are employees when we're talking about Uber and Lyft. And I think that we have to pass state legislation that recognizes them as such. We have to pass the PRO Act at the national level. And then at a city level, there has to be limits on how many cars we have on the road, not just in the interests of workers actually earning a living wage, also because of the issues of climate change. We simply cannot continue to encourage more and more cars to be out there on the road. And then there is the city responsibility where if you have a closed market and you invite people to participate in it, you cannot then open it and then tell those earlier participants that, hey, I'm sorry, but you took a speculative investment and it just didn't work out for you. So I think that there can be a whole range of different ways in which we deal with the horrible nature of these rideshare companies. And frankly, I say that as somebody who was elected this year and who was campaigning last year and had rideshare companies spend tens of thousands of dollars against me because of my platform of classifying these drivers as employees and not as contractors.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, we're now suffering the ramifications of these rideshare apps being successful in their ballot initiatives to reclassify their workers. And they're really suffering the consequences of that, in some cases making far less than minimum wage. So I actually wanted to go back to what you briefly mentioned regarding Mayor Bill de Blasio, because, from what I've seen, there hasn't really been much of a reaction from him, despite the fact that you have some pretty big name Democrats, raising awareness about it, including Ocasio-Cortez and Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer. Has there been any response from Mayor Bill de Blasio? And if not, why do you think that is?
Well, I think that I have hope that there will be progress. Thus far, the public line from the mayor is the same as it has been. Thankfully, because of the organizing that we have done and that NYTWA has really done, the New York Taxi Workers Alliance, the mayor has been asked this question again and again and again at interviews that he's at press conferences, and he's maintained the line that the debt relief plan they have is sufficient. But I do think that there's really a possibility of softening that, and I think that the reason we haven't seen it yet is because of the same reason we see so many issues kind of come to a halt in politics, which is that we're competing for attention against so many other things. And we're having to make it clear that we will not go away, that this is an issue that has to be resolved, and the pressure will only ratchet up. And I think that it comes back to the fact that if you talk about a $65 million debt relief plan, it sounds on the surface of it as if it's sufficient. But if you get into the weeds of it, if you really look at the details, you're seeing that what the city is offering is actually worse than what the market is offering. And what I mean by that is that lenders had approached drivers saying that we can restructure your loan and you'll pay $1,600 a month. And the city comes out in the spring of this year saying, $65 million, we're going to launch a relief plan. This is going to have eligible drivers receive $20,000 as a cash down payment towards the restructuring their loans. That down payment will incentivize lenders to restructure those loans. And then it tells lenders in the details, you can charge up to $2,000 a month in these new loans. So if a lender was offering a driver $1,600 and now they're saying we can give you $20K and you can actually increase your offer to the driver by $400, it's not, government is not supposed to mimic or be a weaker version of the market. It's supposed to take it on. And that is one of the real fundamental issues that we've had in this fight, is that so much of what I'm talking about, so much of this is in the weeds of the fight, and having to get into the weeds and explain that these weeds, while they may not seem that important on their own, these are the weeds that will contribute to more drivers losing their entire livelihoods and their lives to this crisis.
And, so we're in the midst of Striketober, of course, and we're seeing so many private sector workers go on strike across the country. Many of these are taking place in kind of the traditional industrial workplace setting, which, of course, is a welcome sight. But I think, taxi workers don't really fit neatly into some of our ideas of what, organized workers look like. I'm sure there's probably many in the audience that are surprised to hear that there is an organization of taxi workers. So can you kind of talk about not just the New York Taxi Workers Alliance, but what do you see as the role of these kind of non-traditional labor organizations in the future?
That we have to organize every single place that we can, and unions are the most fundamental example of organizing. And I think that it is the absence of organizing that allows capital and allows the state to oppress the working class. And I think that the future, we see so much of the future of employment for so many of my constituents and just people across this country in the more kind of informal economy, the gig economy. These are places where we don't have as many unions who have membership within those worlds. And then we also have the threat of basically company unions, like the Independent Drivers Guild that receives money from Uber, that ostensibly is organizing on behalf of Uber drivers, but is really, ensuring that the organizing never goes to a certain level. This year in Albany, Uber and Lyft tried to pass a bill to create company unions under the guise of, sectoral bargaining and to gut the minimum wage for rideshare drivers in New York City. So we have to both be on the lookout for how corporations will try and take advantage of this new frontier. And we also have to continue to organize to ensure that these workers, who are oftentimes have overlapping identities that allow them even more to be oppressed by capital, that they are organized and that they have the support of existing organized labor and organizations such as DSA and elected officials.
So final question for you. It's a little different from what we've been talking about, but the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation just rejected the NRG's proposal to build a fracked gas peaker in Astoria. Can you talk about your organizing and also how you plan to continue to transform your district as a socialist in office?
Absolutely. So, it's funny. I don't know if tell me if I'm not allowed to show this, but this is a campaign mailer we sent out last year in the course of my campaign. And on the back, one of the promises was to oppose all fossil fuel infrastructure. And this plant being the fundamental piece of infrastructure that was being proposed for the district. And so this has been a fight that we have been involved in for over a year. And our involvement has spanned from, politicizing it in the course of the primary election, attending rallies and marches. We organized volunteers through our office to send over 7,000 postcards to our neighbors across the district, encouraging them to submit a public comment. We called 36,000 households across my district encouraging them to do exactly the same thing. We canvassed at subway stations. We canvassed through small businesses. We canvassed in the park. We put up posters everywhere with URLs where people could submit this public comment. We did everything and anything that we could. And I'm also really proud of the fact that I organized to broaden our electoral coalition, even getting, again, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer to come in and oppose this plant. And I think that this victory is a testament to the organizing we did through my office, through a larger coalition, but fundamentally to the organizing that was done by DSA's Eco-Socialist Working Group, which actually was the organization and the working group that found this issue and made it from something that would have typically been procedural and made it political. And all of it resulted in more than 6,600 comments being submitted for a plant which would typically get a couple hundred comments at that, at best. And 85% of those 6,600 comments were in opposition. And I've been told by people at the agency and at the state level that it is that organizing, it is that large of a coalition that allowed for the agency to take such a step to reject this plant. And I think that, organizing gets the goods. DSA should really be credited with the work that it did to make this into an issue. And I think it paves the way for New York to finally get back into the idea of being a climate leader in this country, because in the last 2 years, we haven't passed any major legislation regarding climate in Albany. And hopefully this decision is the catalyst for passing public power at the state level so we can have publicly controlled and democratically operated utilities here in New York State.
All right. Sounds good.
Let me just close by saying I love that. I love, especially when on a national level, you're hearing all of these pretty depressing stories. You're hearing about the reconciliation bill getting chopped up into bits and pieces with provisions being completely taken out. On a local level, with the organizing that's taking place, there are some pretty significant gains. So thanks for sharing that with us and continuing to fight. It's really important.
You're so welcome. And I would just say to anyone that is feeling that sense of hopelessness, I totally understand. I used to feel it about the climate crisis. But and it's, as you said, you get what you organize for. And at the local level, you can really see the fruits of your labor. And if you had told me a year and a half ago that we would win this, I don't know if I would have fully believed you. I wanted it. I believed in it, but I don't know if I expected it. And that was because I knew we were going up against the eighth largest carbon emitter of U.S. companies across the country. They had spent $600,000 in lobbying elected officials and sending mailers across the country. And here we were, a ragtag group of eco-socialists in alliance with elected officials and other climate organizations, and we beat them. And this could happen in your city, in your town, in your state. And it'll only happen if you make it happen. So there really is hope from the organizing we do. And I have a lot of hope for what will happen in neighboring states and future elections and how we can continue to get lefties across the country in office and doing the right work.
If you enjoyed this video from Jacobin Weekends, please hit like and subscribe. That way, you'll enjoy all of our backlog as well as all of our future content, including interviews, live streams, and clips. Thank you.